There's a passage in all three Gospels, Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus is described as praying alone in the company of his disciples, which suggests something of the paradox of solitude and community. Praying alone in the company of his disciples, as we do perhaps when we meditate together. And then he turns to the disciples and he says, "Who do people say I am?" And they reply, some say John the Baptist, or some say Elijah, the prophet. And he doesn't comment on this piece of market research, but he then looks at them and says, "But who do you say I am?" It's a completely different question. And in the Gospels, Peter jumps in and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." And he then says to them, "You don't tell anyone this." Gives them strict instructions not to tell them that he was the Christ. So it's an interesting exchange, because of course we see the change from the abstract question, in a sense the objective question, "Who do people say I am?" to the personal, subjective question, which establishes a much more direct interpersonal connection. "Who do you say I am?" And if somebody were to put that question to you, and they said to you, "Who do you say I am?" you might think, "Well, who do you think you are? You're so important that I should have to answer that question." And so either this question suggests, a huge ego, hungry for attention and recognition, or it has another meaning. And as Jesus doesn't seem to be that kind of ego, what is he asking this question for? And that's really what I wrote that book, Jesus the Teacher Within, about. And I think that, putting it simply, briefly, I think he knows who he is. He says in the Gospel of John, "I know where I have come from, I know where I am going." Well, that's self-knowledge. And we know that the desert tradition gives us our way of meditation, tells us that self-knowledge is more important than the ability to work miracles. So self-knowledge, as I was saying the other day, changes us. When we come into this experience of the self, it's not just knowledge about ourselves, it's not just facts about ourselves, but it is an experience of the self, that when we enter into that experience, we evolve, we change, we develop. So if Jesus is someone who knows himself and is recognized as a teacher, called a teacher more often than by any other name in the Gospels, then we might also remember that to be in the presence of someone who knows themselves is good for us, because it stimulates our own self-knowledge. We can't give self-knowledge to anybody, but what we can do in helping each other, loving each other, is to bring each other, to guide each other into the light of our true self. That's the meaning of community. So, why is Jesus asking this question? Perhaps to establish this personal connection, which is very direct, intimate really. Who do you say I am? Challenging. And at the same time, in a way, unanswerable. But it establishes a connection. And the purpose of this connection is not to enhance his identity or ego, but for our sake. It is so that we can be drawn into that redemptive or fulfilling, healing experience of self-knowledge that we've also called the experience of God. So here we see the value of a teacher, and we can discover this meaning of a teacher in many ways, at many levels. I think meditation group is an experience of a teacher in the same way, or a similar way, that the relationship to the group and the members of the group is a kind of connection with a friendship. To put it in simple terms, it's a friendship, but it's also a kind of a raising of consciousness. So the sum of the parts, the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. So, self-knowledge, identity, very much at the heart of the human process of growth, development, integration and evolution, coming to know ourselves in this way. Just go back to what they said about people said Jesus was. One of their answers was Elijah, because Elijah and Elisha, the prophets of the Jewish tradition, of course, had many miracles in their stories, especially Elisha, that were kind of reflected in the biography of Jesus. The healing of, even the raising of the dead, and many healing stories. And here's one of these stories, the healing of Naaman the Syrian from the widespread disease of leprosy. If you were at Mass a couple of weeks ago, they had this story, I think they did, didn't they, in the first reading, didn't they? And then the healing of the 10 lepers in the Gospel story. But let's just listen to this, because it's again about healing. It tells us something about how we approach health and how we respond to healing too. So let's begin with this story. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honourable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valour, but a leper. So who was he? The commander-in-chief or a leper, or both? And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria," that's Elisha, "for he would heal him of his leprosy." The importance of the servant is very strong in this story and many other stories. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, "Thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel." Then the king of Syria said, "Okay, go," well, he didn't say okay, but that's what he said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he departed. He sent him off for a consultation. Right? And he took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. So this was not just a quick overnight trip. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, "Now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy." And it happened when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of leprosy? Therefore please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me." So already we've got some misunderstanding in the medical system. So it was. So it was when Elisha the man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, so the word gets around quickly, that he sent to the king saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know there is a prophet in Israel." So the king didn't twig that it wasn't he who was going to save him, but the prophet. Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean." So he comes to Elisha's house, and Elisha doesn't even come out of the house. He greets an areas with his retinue, and Elisha just sends a messenger out saying, "Go and jump in the river," which is about the size of this river here, I think. If you've ever been to see the Jordan, it's a little trickle really, and you shall be clean. But Naaman was furious, and he went away and said, "Indeed, I said to myself, he will come out to me, surely, and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place, and heal my leprosy." So he had imagined exactly what was going to happen. This prophet was going to come out wearing his white coat and stethoscope, and with his with all his tests and results, and he was going to say, and you can have some more tests as well. And then he says, "Are not the Abanar and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? So, could I not wash in them and be clean?" So this pathetic little Israeli river. So he turned away and went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spoke. See the importance of servants again. It was the servant girl who had sent him in the first place. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So, it worked. Then he returned to the man of God, the prophet, he and all his aides, and he came and stood before him, and he said, "Indeed, now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now therefore, please take a gift from your servant." But he said, "As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing." And he urged him to take it, but he refused. So Naaman said, "Then if not, please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth, for your servant will no longer offer either burnt offering or sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. So I'm going to worship the God of this earth, of this land. So I'm going to take the earth back with me and make a little shrine back in Syria. Yet in this thing, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the temple of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please pardon your servant in this thing." So in other words, I'm going to start worshipping your God, but I've still got to keep in with my boss, so I'm going to keep up appearances. So then he said to him, if you go in peace, he said, well, go away, just go. And he departed from him a short distance. And then there's another twist to the story, which is about another servant, but we don't need to go into that. So it's quite a dramatic parable, little story of what was. So we have a person who is in the prime of life and struck down with an illness, and he listens to the servant girl, because there's nothing else, and he obviously has no other good ideas, so he makes this long trip to Israel, and is then offended because he's not put to the top of the list, and given priority treatment. But the servant, or another servant, comes in and persuades him not to stalk off in a temper. What's the servant mean? What does the servant symbolize?
Jesus.
Okay.
Faith.
Faith.
Humility.
Humility.
It's conscience.
His own conscience. Yeah.
His awareness.
His awareness. Yeah. Okay. His awareness. Yeah. Humble awareness. Some little voice that says, okay, you're acting like a real
Sure.
yes. Okay. So he listened to that. The still small voice.
Oh, Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit. Okay. So
It's awareness too, isn't it?
just awareness. Yeah.
Awareness to be aware of information from diverse places.
Yeah. Yeah. Listening to yourself as well as to the external events. And can we sympathize with his anger with Elisha? And why didn't Elisha come out to greet him?
To prove it wasn't him that did it.
Hmm?
It wasn't necessary to prove it wasn't him that did it.
That it wasn't necessary.
Yes.
But it would also have,
Wasn't
To be
necessary.
made into, so important.
it was also have been participating in the whole thing about important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so he's
Through the social dimensions of it.
No, he wasn't entangled in the food.
what?
He
Thank you.
wasn't tangling in the parade of the now.
Yes.
Yeah. The social niceties that come through
Yeah.
the protocols.
He wasn't a servant.
Hmm?
He wasn't a
And
servant.
he wasn't a servant, yes, okay, yes. He was a man of God, he was a prophet, he was living in a little hut, but he knew who he was. And he wasn't going to get caught up in Naaman's ego. Do you get caught up in patients' egos sometimes?
Yes.
You get caught in
Yeah.
it? How does that happen?
Well, if you've very strong personalities and if they question every single thing that happens, and they might be justified in questioning it, it does put people slightly on the defensive to justify things. So they're dictating sometimes, so sometimes that can happen.
Mm.
Especially when the diagnosis isn't always 100% clear at that point in time, or the treatment isn't 100% effective.
Mm. So it puts you on the defensive, is it?
Yeah, it will happen, because patients sometimes look for a cure that isn't always available.
Yeah.
And even if it is a cure, getting them to realise that they have to go down a certain pathway. They have to wash in the
Yeah.
We have to get the tests.
Okay, so
There's a sort of a truism or there's a perception that when the patient is a doctor, it always goes wrong. And the reason perhaps is that everybody's behaviour changes. They're responding to the sort of ego of the patient
I see.
in a damaging way.
Okay. Good. Oh, very interesting. So you've got a relationship issue then in the healing arts. Your relationship with the patient is integral to the healing. Carl Jung said that in the therapeutic relationship, the therapist and the patient, analyst, the most important single element is the self-knowledge of the therapist.
It's our egos get caught up in their egos. There's kind of a transference and counter-transference.
Right.
That's really about the heads,
Okay.
as opposed to the body.
Right. Okay, so the story is about a healing, but it's not just a technical or magical healing. It's a human. It occurs within a human relationship. It's not that the relationship is the whole reason for the cure necessarily, for the healing, but it's context, condition for it.
But
That relationship and this whatever perception the therapist has of other relationships that they're reminded of by the presence of the other person and the history of those coming in.
Right, yes,
They put a perception onto the client
yeah.
and vice versa.
So the two,
We're operating out of different...
in a way it's not an equal, it's kind of equal in a way, but it's not an equal relationship because the patient is obviously anxious and desperate perhaps. The practitioner is
anxious.
well, maybe anxious, but is also supposed to be, trained and well informed and detached and has a skill to use, certain arts to use. So it's not an equal relationship, but it's not a hierarchical relationship, or shouldn't be hierarchical. So the more self-knowledge there is in each person, the better. So if they both began with a period of meditation, they might be a little bit. So if meditation, leads us to self-knowledge, then you could say that it helps us to enter into that healing process, the healing relationship, more effectively.
Newman is tied up very much in his own identity, isn't he? His
Yeah.
social identity. And washing in the trickle of water, or light not coming out to him, has broken that. So he comes to listen more carefully to the servant tell him.
Yeah. And when he comes out, well, first of all, the treatment. What about the treatment? What's
relevant, you have to have faith.
You have to be okay. He has to have faith. His servant, his little voice, pushed him into an act of faith. And then what are the other elements of the story? Of the treatment?
Water.
Or water, something big, pure and simple. Or baptism, yes. It's
Repetition.
repetition, isn't it? It's not just one application. It takes time. It has a ritual aspect to it. Why do we have to repeat things?
Think.
Yeah, that's exactly what Jesus said to the disciples. Why are you so slow? You don't understand anything I'm saying to you. Just keep saying the same thing over and over and over again. Okay, so
More aware.
what? So repetition is an essential part of learning too, isn't it? We learn by repetition, by imitation.
Yeah, children keep asking if you tell them a story, you have to repeat it exactly the same.
Yeah.
Yes. That, it goes back to that image, become a child.
Until we've learned, yeah. So it's a child. And then, so then it works. He does this act of faith, and faith involves repetition, as like the mantra. involves repetition. It's faithful. We say mantra faithfully. We come to any spiritual practice with that quality of faith, perseverance, and saying he's cured. But what else has happened to him?
He becomes a believer of the He's got to be sorry.
Yes.
Yet he's still very aware that he has to bow down before Rama if he's to keep his job.
But it's not like it is a process.
Yes.
Reconciled is different. At some level, is it a story about he's transcending his ego, or his ego has been transcended,
Yeah.
because that is what Elijah has done to him by not coming out to him, by sending him to a small little river, by getting him to repeat it a number of times. And in some ways, that's the healing. Whereas whether it's actually healed or not, maybe the story is about not so much the healing of leprosy, but the healing of him.
Yes. So you see again a distinction between the cure, which is great if it happens, and it did happen, and the healing, because he seems more. I mean, would you say he's enlightened?
Yeah, self-aware.
Is he?
At the start.
No,
No, at the end.
He's converted.
Self-aware though.
Huh?
He's self-aware.
He's Is he enlightened?
No, not yet.
Is he there? Excuse me.
No. He's on the way.
Okay. So what's changed in him? How has he changed? If he's not the same as he was, if there has been a
He's converted.
to
He revered the great, the wealth and the power to the simple and easy. He was converted from one way of adoration of respect or application to life in another way.
Okay, yeah. He's changed his belief system, definitely, in that there's, but he hasn't, it's he's still keeping on the old belief system for pragmatic reasons, rather like the early Roman priests in the early centuries before the establishment of the church. They used to come to the Christians and say, I'd like these were the Roman pagan priests who were like civil servants, really. They had to produce the temple sacrifices in every day. It was just a job. They had to say the words exactly and keep the rituals going. But they didn't regard it as a spiritual thing, but they were attracted to Christianity as a spiritual path. They would come and ask for baptism, and then the Christians would say, no, you can't be a Christian and doing this, cutting the throats of all these chickens and bulls all the time, worshipping the emperor, Anyway, so he's a bit in that space, isn't he? So his belief system has certainly been affected. He hasn't quite clicked over yet, but anyway, something has changed in him. But in himself, just listen to this turn of voice. He says, Elijah sent a message out to him saying, go and wash in the Jordan. But Naaman became furious and went away and said, indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. That's what he should have done. Anyway, so that's one Naaman. The other Naaman is, he returned to the man of God and came and stood before him and said, indeed, now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Please take the gift from your servant. So he's the servant now. And when the gift is refused, you'd think he'd get furious, but he doesn't. He accepts that response, and he says, okay, well, at least let me take a couple of mule loads of earth back with me so I can stay connected to this God that I've met here. So what's the change in him?
He has become a servant.
He's become a servant.
He's learned to listen to his inner voice and sort of focus on interior rather than external things.
Okay, yeah. He's less angry, less uptight, less stressed, less full of himself.
He's been grounded.
He's grounded literally, yes.
Literally.
Yeah, grounded and washed. Yeah. Humility, it comes from the word humus, earth. So the earth he's taken back is almost a symbol of that humility. So he's a kind of much nicer guy, really, isn't he? What do you think he'll be like when he gets back to Syria?
It would be like the Jews of old pining for Israel and the Holy Land.
Maybe. Maybe, yeah. Anyway, he's certainly been deeply changed.
Where in the Bible is it then?
This is it's the second book of Kings, chapter 5. 2 Kings 5. Okay.
Do you think you actually have leprosy at all, or do you think leprosy is just a yeah, for a balance?
I did read an article about that a long time ago. I think that leprosy was the word given to many forms of skin disease, which were very prevalent for various reasons, I suppose, in that part of the world. So it may not have been leprosy as we understand it.
If you wash 7 times in the river, your skin is going to get soft in the air.
To cure my
Yeah.
Would there lots of
It was
stigma attached
told
to that?
Huh?
Would there have been lots of stigma attached to having leprosy?
Well, yes, there was, wasn't there? Although
I mean,
it's
you might have
interesting.
overcompensated for it by his importance in the realm.
Yes.
That's what surprised me, that he still had the job he had,
Yes, that's
having
true.
leprosy.
I don't know what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It may be the technical.
Might have been eczema on the face, and that'd be a big deal.
Yes. And they didn't know what it was. It
Yeah.
might have been.
This looks bad from my position.
Yeah.
Maybe it was still in early.
They didn't realise maybe it was infectious at that time, like when Jesus' time they realised the infectivity of it, even though it's low infectivity it does.
And the ordinary people call everything leprosy, and you're an unclean person.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Okay, well, we'll
It
look
must
up.
have been a fairly decent chapter at the same time, because the fact that the servants, there was that level of awareness, because he does listen to the servants, to the girl first and then to his own. So there was a two-way communication. He wasn't
Yeah.
a complete autocrat.
No. No, that's true. If he hadn't been, had some ability to listen and change his mind and trust, he wouldn't have made the journey. So, okay, so it shows us whatever the disease was, whatever the facts are in the case. It shows us that in that process of healing, it is, if we take the full meaning of health into account, it's not just the symptoms of the condition that are cured, but in the process the person is changed. I mean, we saw that if a cure brings about that change, which we would call a greater level of health because of the person has changed, then even in the absence of a cure, the healing can happen. Okay. That's a big shift, perhaps, in our understanding of health. Obviously, it would be better if there's a cure, but if there isn't, then healing can still take place. And an essential element of or dimension of the relationship with the healer, the person practicing the healing arts, that relationship is important for the healing process to take place. If that relationship is not present, then perhaps the healing won't take place, or it will be more difficult for the healing to take place. So the quality of the relationship between the practitioner and the patient is essential, not so much for the cure, but certainly for the healing. And what we see is that the sign of that greater health or healing that takes place is within the self-knowledge of the person, which is to say, of the patient, which is to say, Naaman was a different person. He related to himself differently, less of a jerk, and that clearly is expressed in his relationship to other people. So what we could say perhaps is that all of this is a manifestation of this experience of God we've been talking about, the experience of God that happens through faith and happens everywhere and anywhere. It's not restricted to any particular moment or practice. It leads to wholeness, to health, to an integration. Any experience of God is going to heighten our non-dualistic awareness. What does that mean, our non-dualistic awareness? Well, the non-dualistic awareness means the awareness that there is no absolute separation between me and you. Doesn't mean to say I am you, or that I'm going to collapse my ego into yours, but it means that I am conscious, aware of the interrelatedness that is between us, that is part of my reality and your reality, that we are sharing, participating in a reality bigger than either of us, and even bigger than both of us. So there are stages, of course, in the development of that non-dualistic awareness. Non-duality means literally not two, but it means not one, not two. It means essentially we can't count. I think that listening to the Radio 4 News this morning, and there was, I should have recorded it and brought it in, because it was a little item about children's health, and there was, I don't know who she was, but she was somebody who seemed to know, was convinced she knew what she was talking about, and rattling off these statistics. And these statistics, of course, have tremendous authority, because you take them, first of all, you believe them, because it's, I don't know, like the way we believe things if they're written in print, and somebody must have counted all these things, you know. And but statistics, although they are very persuasive, they don't, they in another way kind of leave us cold. It's not that they are not unimportant, but that they don't give us the final measure of what health is. The number of children suffering from this or that. Rickets is coming back into the UK world. Okay, so you can build a very passionate rhetorical campaign on that statistic, but you know, any reasonable person would want to put it into context. And anyway, so we're very influenced and often intimidated by statistics. And probably the first thing that somebody asks you as a doctor when you're diagnosing a serious illness is, well, what are my chances? You know, and then you may say, well, I can give you some figures, but really, you know, you are you, and I don't know where you are in the statistics, so maybe it's not so important to give you the statistics. But the person will still probably say, yes, okay, but tell me what are my chances? You know, 1 in 5, and then you'll give them the statistical response, perhaps. So there is a sense in which we want to measure health, but there's a much deeper sense in which we cannot measure health. We may be able to measure certain probabilities about curing, but certainly not health. So we use this word health in ways that often trip us up and lead us into judgments and relationships and tones of voice. And this woman on the radio this morning, you know, she was very aggressive. I think to say maybe she was passionate about the things she was arguing for, but it was a hype too. And is there a much if we have the bigger meaning or picture of health in mind, would not our tone be different? The tone of our treatment, the tone of the relationship, the pace in which we see people, the time we give to them, wouldn't that be different than if we're approaching it merely from this statistical and of course financially measurable position? But it's not this kind of like we were saying yesterday about the apophatic and the cataphatic, the way of knowing and the way of unknowing. You need both. Everyone's saying we shouldn't have tests and statistics, but it's not the whole picture. And if you don't go with the whole picture, this is going to unbalance the way the service is offered or the relationship in which healing takes place, with or without a cure, the way the relationship unfolds. So in other words, in a way, it's simply asking for the human element, the human dimension, to be respected. And you could say this is the mystery of health. The mystery is something that can be certainly experienced, but cannot be measured. Can you measure? You can certainly measure the degree of infection or disfigurement on Naaman's body. You could measure that in the period of time. You could say that his 50% of his body surface has been cleared. But can you measure change that took place in him as he became a nicer person and a more real person? Can't measure that. Carl Jung says you have to his students, he used to say, you have to study well, learn it, or it may even have been Freud, I think, who said this, anyway, that you have to study hard, but when you come into contact with the mystery of the living soul, forget everything you've learned, and just don't apply that. Well, apply it, but give your attention to the person, the unique individual you're with. Now this element of reality that cannot be measured, we call it the mystery of life, is at the heart of Christian doctrine, for example. God and man, not 50% and 50%, but God and man, not monotheistic or dualistic. The image of the Trinity, the symbol of the Trinity, is not really about number. You cannot count the number of persons in God, or who are of the Trinity. Augustine said, "Qui incipit numerare, incipit errare." Whoever begins to count begins to make a mistake. So there are certain things that we have to be very aware of as soon as we start to count them, to measure them. Some things we can measure, some things we have to be very aware of. One is not a number, but it expresses a unity. And a unity or wholeness, non-duality, is really what we mean by health. Health is this experience of our oneness, whether or not we have leprosy or terminal stomach cancer. We are capable of experiencing our personal, our real unity. And that experience is the measure, if you like, of our health. And it's in this experience of our health, of our wholeness, therefore, of our oneness, that we know who we are. That's where our identity comes into focus. Who do you say I am? That question is meant to ask us, who do you actually know yourself to be? And this is not the same as identification. The police may identify a robber and pick him up and take him to the station, take a photograph of him and his fingerprints. But the robber's mother, who turns up in the middle of the night, knows better who he is, who this boy is. She knows his real identity. Well, the police have identified him. So, again, in so many of the systems in which our lives and institutions in which our lives unfold today, we have processes of identification. We identify a problem, we try to solve the problem. We identify a disease and we cure the disease. So again, it's not that the police are quite right to take a photograph and try to identify this criminal, but we shouldn't forget that that is not the whole person or the true person. And in the same way, the patient may need to be identified in terms of certain symptoms and types of treatment. But in doing so, it would be tragic to lose a sense of the identity of the person. Because if you lose that identity, you have no relationship, or little of a relationship. And if you've got no relationship, then the healing cannot take place. You need the healing, you need the relationship with the patient to allow that healing to take place, whatever the results of the treatment. To be healed involves, and so to find your health, to be healed involves having one's identity respected and indeed recognized and known. And this is perhaps what we mean by quality of care above all. It's not just that you don't make mistakes, or even if you do make mistakes, the quality of care. Who was saying this recently, that if you, I don't know if it was somebody here or somebody recently said to me, even if you make, somebody was telling me anyway, even if you make lots of mistakes, or you make mistakes, or if you make lots of mistakes, there might be a problem, but if you make mistakes, but people, you have a good relationship, and they trust you, then you can, they're not likely to drag you through the courts.
More forgiving.
And more forgiving.
Actually, there was actually a study done on this where they looked at the US doctors who'd been sued a lot,
Oh, yeah.
and they looked at US doctors who hadn't been sued. And it's quite a large group, I think it was 400 in each. And they got consent to record them speaking to patients. And they measured them on 3 criteria. First was their manners. The second was their abilities and their technical abilities, the information they gave or their abilities, right? And the third was any word or anything that involved a connection with the person, something that comes back to their relationship, compassion, or something that was associated with a deeper connection with the person. So in other words, good morning, how are you? What's your treatment? That's different. But if something opened up in the conversation, or that allowed them to have a deeper relationship. And they found that there was no difference, well, sort of, at the end of the study, you can guess as I'm saying it, but they found that there was no difference in their manners, and there was no difference in their technical ability. But there was a big difference in their ability to connect.
So
You see somebody as human. If you have that relationship, you see somebody as being another human, able to make mistakes or capable of making mistakes. So you are more accepting of them.
I suppose it doesn't mean you heal them more, it means you get sued less. That particular study.
So I think we should be able to get the insurance companies to fund this course.
But it is recognised with the patient community very sick. I know I over the years I've been a bit obsessive to make sure I contact all the family and the relatives, like the partner and the children, to make sure I know exactly what I try to get to know them many as are possible, because like that, if things go wrong, it goes on. I know in the study in the Americans, they say, I know, quoted by one of the American physicians I worked with once in the States, he says, don't forget that physicians judge you by your ability, your availability, and your affability in that order. But patients judge you and your affability, your availability, and last of all, in your ability.
Truth in it. Maybe you should tattoo that on the arms of your students, in medical students. Okay, so this what we call quality of care, and it can be measured. That quality of life can be measured up to a point. It gives us indications, but it doesn't exhaust the meaning of it. And the point here is that the healing that can take place, whether or not there is a cure, depends upon the relationship, the connection within therapeutic connection. And that involves, any relationship means that there's going to be a mutual recognition of identity. Now, there's a professional relationship, there are certain boundaries. In most cases, the big difference with doctors, I think, is when you speak to an ordinary person. I don't know if this is true of doctors when they're off duty, but normally when you start to tell somebody something that's wrong with you, it's within moments they start telling you about their own problems. Do you know that? So you say, I have got this terrible headache, I can't sleep now. Yeah, I had that too. I think it's not so total egoism, but it's I suppose that we don't know what to say or what to do. We want to show sympathy, so we want to say, well, I had the same thing, I know what you're going through, but it's not actually what you want to hear. Yeah. You either just want someone to listen and say, oh, it's really bad, I hope it gets better soon, or maybe give some advice, but you don't need to hear all there. So when you go to see your doctor or your practitioner or your herbalist, you don't expect them to start unloading all the worries and their personal work problems onto you. So there are boundaries within the professional relationship. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean to say you can't be personal. that you can't recognize the other person. Well, it makes a big difference if you remember their name. Who was saying the other day, somebody was saying the other day that they got a phone call from a patient who said, I'm the guy who had the chest pain.
I'm the heart doctor.
So he said, I know lots of people, well he didn't say, but he must have thought, I know, all my patients have got chest pain. He happened to recognize his voice, fortunately. So we need to be able to know the identity of the person rather than just identify them as a case. And that involves recognizing, of course, the unique person that they are and the unique circumstances of their life. There's many moments in the Gospels where we see how identification or recognition of identity, recognizing the person, that's what true identity is, brings about a healing or is the context for healing. In many cases, for example, in the resurrection appearance of Jesus to Mary of Magdala, she comes to the tomb, finds the tomb empty, is weeping, sees Jesus, but doesn't recognize him, thinks that he's the gardener, speaks to him, even says, where have you put the body of Jesus? And then he turns and says to her, Mary. And she recognizes it. Then she says, Rabboni, Master. So there's not even an explanation here, because you don't need an explanation. There's this immediate reaction or response, immediate response. When you are known, you know. This takes us, I think, down to the heart of the meaning of non-duality too. That it's in this relationship that we are known and we know at the same time. And to be known is, to be recognized, is immensely affirmative and healing. Many people, different groups will say, the thing that hurts the most is it being invisible, being unrecognized. I think women, we had a friend who was a sister, a very strong personality, American, New Yorker, and she was the spiritual director of a large seminary. And this was quite a few years ago, and the Vatican was trying to get women out of seminaries. And so they had some bishop came to examine this seminary, and all the staff, the teachers and the spiritual directors were all there. And this bishop walked in, shook hands with everybody except her. And he didn't want her to be there, and so whether consciously or not, I hope not consciously, but anyway, consciously or not, he didn't see her. And she walked straight past her. And she gave him what for later. But so there's nothing worse than not being recognized or being deliberately overlooked. And how powerful it is, though, when even in a short time, it doesn't take a lot to know that you're recognized. And I don't think people need a lot of time. They just, those sort of professional encounters, but they certainly we need to feel recognized. But we identify a dead body in that sense, but we know the identity of living individuals. That always happens in the present moment. And even though we may have seen the person before, and we've got lots of files on them. Each meeting with them is something is new, is fresh. It's like, you know, our meditation. There's repetitiveness to it. There's a magical number of 7 times in which we immerse ourselves in this, and yet each time is a representation and making present again. And then finally, I would say we could think of faith. You know, all of this, you could say, is the experience of God. That the practitioner, medical practitioner, has a very privileged life, along with other professions. But because of the particular circumstances in which they are meeting and relating to other human beings, the experience of God should be more to the surface, in a sense, you know, more immediate, more conscious. Now, it isn't that that the experience of God literally is more powerful or you know, more likely than for an accountant meeting with his customers, his clients, but there is something more in the relationship with the whole of the person, especially in their need and their pain. That comes to what should we say, the opportunities or the likelihood of being touched by this experience of God should be much greater. You know, even if you're tired, even if you're stressed, you're still in this. Provided you can bring this freshness or this presentness, you can be present. As soon as you've lost this ability to be present, then the encounter becomes something mechanical or
Draining.
yeah?
Or draining.
Or draining, yes, exactly, yeah. You just feel another one more taken out of me, you know. So the ability to remain in a healthy relationship with yourself is of course critical to being in a healthy relationship to others. And faith is the medium of this experience. Remember, faith is not the same as belief. Faith is our capacity for commitment, for transcendence, and ultimately for love. So it's anything that builds up this relational quality of faith is going to be beneficial in all aspects of our life. Especially, most people spend most of their time at work, don't they? So, especially in our work. And meditation, you could say, has an immediate impact upon this aspect of our life because it is the building up and the deepening of our faith. It is a way of faith.